All right, there we go. Welcome. Such a beautiful day. I think the temperature's supposed to drop a lot tomorrow, so it's going to feel like October tomorrow. But thank you all for coming. All right. My name is Marcus Casey. I'm one of the meditation instructors here at Columbus KTC, so please make yourselves comfortable, relax, and open your minds to the words of our teachers. Sometimes in Buddhism, we hear the phrase, the 10 directions and the 3 times. And the 10 directions are pretty self-explanatory. It's basically which way's north? North, south, east, west, and then northeast, southeast, southwest, and northwest. So that's 8. And then up and down. So basically implying everywhere. And the 3 times are the past, the present, and the future. And this is a very poetic way of describing all-pervasiveness, the all-pervasiveness of Buddha nature. It's basically saying everywhere and at every time. And I got to thinking about the fact that, at least for me, it's a lot easier to kind of grasp and understand the concept of space and the everywhere than it is the idea of time. So with spatial relationships, with the 10 directions, I can be in one place here, but I can look and see you are in another place there, and that's not complicated to me. Time, though, gets more complicated. I'm experiencing now, and you are right here in the same room with me, also experiencing that same now. And I have memories of a time that wasn't now, but it was now when I was experiencing it, right? And you were there in that now as well. And we certainly have, beliefs and expectations about a now that hasn't happened yet. And we pile all sorts of hopes and fears into that projection of a future. But all we ever actually get is an infinite, eternal now. And as soon as we focus on that now, the now that we're trying to experience is gone, and we're in a new now. And then that one's gone too, and then that one's gone too. And that's why it's an eternal now. It's eternally in flux, it's eternally changing, and it's eternally now. The Dharma teaches us that we have been experiencing this eternal now since beginningless time. That's a hard one to wrap your head around. Beginningless time. And yet, in this case, it doesn't really seem like practice makes perfect, right? At least not for me. I've had a mental consciousness for 50 years in this lifetime. And before that, from beginningless time. The author Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book in which he tells us that practicing anything for 10,000 hours is the way to mastery. But I'm living proof that I can far, far exceed that amount of time and still struggle to be present in the moment, even for the tiniest amount of time. So today, let's review what our teachers have to say about our mental attitude as we move through that ever-changing infinite now. Let's take a very short moment to let go of stresses and distractions and just breathe in and out for a moment. Okay, before we go any further, it's our tradition to say together the 4-line refuge prayer when we start. The prayer is in Tibetan, and if you don't know it, listen and make the aspiration to awaken and to help others awaken. But I think we'll do it in English once as well. So when we're chanting this, we are repeating our commitment to take refuge in the 3 jewels: the Buddha, or the goal, what we aspire to, the Dharma, or the path, and the Sangha, our guides and companions along the path. So let's say it once in Tibetan, once in English, and then a second time in Tibetan. It's on your laminated handout there. O Sanje Chudang Tsoki Chognam La Jangchu Bardu Dagni Kyapsuchi Dagi Jinsoki Pe Sunamgi Drola Penshir Sanje Druparsho. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the assembly most excellent, I take refuge until I reach enlightenment. By the merit of generosity and other good deeds, may I achieve enlightenment for the sake of all beings. Sangye Chidang Tsoki Chognam La Jangchu Bardu Dagni Kyapsuchi Dagi Jinsogi Pe Sunamgi Drola Penshir Sangye Druparsho. So, as I was preparing this talk, I was looking at a book by Pema Chodron called The Places That Scare You. And I found this quote by the great 20th century master Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. And I'm going to say this slowly so that we have time to take it in and really digest it. He says, the everyday practice is simply to develop a complete acceptance and openness to all situations and emotions, and to all people, experiencing everything totally without mental reservations and blockages, so that one never withdraws or centralizes into oneself. And he says the everyday practice, that's the way we practice, by developing acceptance and openness to whatever comes, so that we never withdraw or centralize into ourselves. So let's take some of those words from that, and I want to do just a really quick kind of mental examination. I'm going to repeat a few key words or phrases from this sentence, and I want you to see if you can identify in your bodies what those words feel like when you hear them. So just get really comfortable. Acceptance. Openness. Experiencing everything totally. blockages. Reservations. Withdrawal. You can really feel the difference, can't you? I mean, at least I can really feel a tangible difference between what it feels like in yourself to be accepting and accepted, to be open, to experience everything, versus being all blocked and reserved and withdrawn. As we walk through our infinite eternal now, in every moment we have a choice as to whether our mind is accepting and open and experiencing everything totally, or if it has reservations and is blocked or withdrawn. Much of the modern emphasis on mindfulness is about teaching people to notice the texture of their minds. And our calm abiding meditation practice, or shamatha, that we learn and that we practice at 10 o'clock every day, and that we have the Intro to Mindfulness class for, that calm abiding meditation practice gives us the skill to notice when our minds are plagued by this contraction and withdrawal, and to drop the stories and to open up. So the first of those lists feels so much better to us, so much more relaxed and pleasant. It kind of brings the question, why do we so often default to contracting into ourselves? His Holiness the 17th Karmapa wrote a great book called Interconnected, and I know we've done a book study on this some years ago when it first came out. He has a chapter in that book called Opening Heart and Mind, and he starts off saying, our era of connectivity poses particular challenges to keeping our heart and mind open. We are exposed to so many images and reports of violence and misery that we feel as if we ourselves are being bombarded. It is a common experience when watching the news on TV or the computer screen to feel that all the suffering we see is being transmitted to us, making us suffer ourselves. And our response is often to shut down, thinking, I can't take any more suffering. I need to protect my own happiness. We change to another channel or web page. But the suffering in the world is still out there. And by turning away from it, we are not truly protecting ourselves. On the contrary, we are harming ourselves because we are damaging immeasurably valuable resources within us. The resources that we urgently need in order to protect, the resources that we urgently need to protect in order to live well in an interdependent world. The damage is not done by the news of suffering. The real damage is done by our own hardening of our hearts to that suffering. We harm ourselves when we close off from others. This makes it especially important that we actively work to keep our minds and hearts open for our own sake and for the benefit of others. And His Holiness goes on to say that opening your heart and mind to others requires trust. He says that our culture teaches us that trust must be earned and that we should always be careful whom we trust. But he says that that is not the kind of altruistic trust that leads to openness. He says our trust is a gift to others. He says, from my side, I offer trust. My trust is unconditional. I simply do not wish to base it on how others behave. In that sense, there is no reason for my trust. It is an unconditional gift. I am not engaging in barter for trust. If you do this for me, you can cash it in for my trust. Trust is something I place in others freely out of what you might call the goodness of my heart. That seems pretty scary, doesn't it? That seems naive. It feels like we're setting ourselves up to be hurt if we do that, and that we're working against our own self-interests if we're too trusting. But His Holiness challenges us to examine what our self-interests actually are. He says, our own goodness and purity are far too valuable to compromise in the face of relatively less important matters. Personally, I see it as vastly more important to protect one's open-hearted altruism and one's open-minded goodness than to protect any shorter-term interests. To protect oneself means to protect one's own pure nature. This is the most important protection we can give ourselves, and protecting ourselves this way also protects others. That's pretty radical, isn't it? It's just radical to think that it's better to be taken advantage of, to lose out on something, than to lose our own pure intentions and our own goodness and our own open-heartedness and compassion. If we learn to live in the infinite, eternal now, it is easier to let go of our constant need to protect our short-term interests. We can instead live in such a way that our heart stays present and open. His Holiness says that developing the capacity to remain open and willing to see the suffering of others has to be developed gradually. He says this is a practice and it cannot be rushed. He says that if we try to open ourselves too much, too quickly, we risk becoming overwhelmed and shutting down altogether. You, like me, you may have had a little bit of reaction when you heard some of his words about giving trust unconditionally and without being earned. We have to prepare ourselves for it. He says that as in any gradual training process, at the beginning we will find it easier to stay open to some people than others. Some people might find they connect more readily with animals rather than humans. Certainly, there will be some people we open to almost effortlessly and others that require concerted effort. This is quite normal, and we can start from there. This need not pose a problem. It only becomes a problem when we stop expanding our capacity to feel connected, leaving others outside the walls of our own ego-centered world. In case you haven't noticed, this is election season in this country. And while I'm always grateful for our democracy and always exercise my right to vote, this season can be very difficult on my attempt to develop universal and unconditional openness and compassion. My fears of the future too often lead me to hoping and delighting in the downfall of others. That's why His Holiness says that keeping our minds and hearts open requires a great deal of courage. He says that for our compassion to become universal, we must teach our heart to be radically open and radically inclusive. Not a single being is left outside. Human or animal, no matter how large or small, no matter how many or how few, since there is no difference in their wish to be happy, we do not exclude them from our compassion and care. It does not matter whether we know them or not. We know that they share the same existential condition as us. The courage of an open heart is key. And the reason this requires courage and the reason His Holiness calls this radical is because we have to face some of our own fundamental fears in order to live with an acceptance of the present moment. To describe those fundamental fears, let's talk about the Buddha's first teachings after his awakening. In that first teaching, he told us that we suffer because we reject instead of accept. This rejection of the present moment takes the form of either desire for what is not or rejection of what is. We are constantly flowing in a stream of now, the main attribute of which is that it's always changing. It's impermanent. If we are constantly trying to hold on to that which is impermanent, we are going to constantly be in a state of suffering. And that is why the way out of our suffering is to have the courage to let go of our fears and practice a radical acceptance of the present moment. There's a popular book by the title of Radical Acceptance. It's written by an American psychologist who is also a Buddhist practitioner from another tradition. Her name is Tara Brach, and the book is called Radical Acceptance, Embracing Your Life with the Heart of a Buddha. And she writes that in any given moment, the full, non-resisting presence of radical acceptance opens me to the beauty and goodness that is always here. Within and around us, it reveals the loving awareness that is our shared essence. She's talking about our Buddha nature here, and we'll get into that more in a little while. Our nature is loving awareness, and contracting around our fears and anxieties closes us off from that nature. But living in a radical openness in the now opens us up to our intrinsic nature. And as we open up, we can learn to accept our own imperfections, the imperfections of others, aging, the grief of loss, making it possible to face and respond to the suffering of racism, inequity, and privilege. It strengthens our resilience in the face of climate change, the pandemic, the seeming vulnerability of our democracy, and the ongoing violence and wars around the world. She says that even for those less directly impacted by global crises, it is natural to encounter our world with a heavy heart. None of us can avoid experiencing how divided our society is, how radically unaccepting, hostile, and mistrusting we are of those deemed other. Projecting badness onto others, turning others into the enemy, increases when humans are gripped by fear. We see this when people view immigrants and refugees as enemies, when they attack those holding opposing political views or feel threatened by those of certain races or religions, gender or sexual identities. The hatred and contempt of enemies is the root of human violence, and seems hypercharged in our traumatized world. So, obviously, we have differing political beliefs in our Sangha, and as a Sangha, we do not take any specific political stances. But I think for many, the events of January 6, 2021 were very disturbing. And Tara Brach was living in that area at the time, in the DC area at the time. And she writes about this, and I think it's important to watch how she works with her mind as this was all unfolding. So she says, I live 25 minutes from the Washington, D.C. Capitol, and news of the insurrection unfolded, as news of the insurrection unfolded, shock and alarm flooded my nervous system. The shock then morphed into anger at the perpetrators, a deep sense of aversion and blame. It was when I realized I was creating an enemy that I paused and mindfully opened to the anger. Feeling the pressure in my chest and the heat in my chest and the tightness in my throat and the clenching of my jaw, allowing myself to fully experience the rawness of that energy. As the blaming thoughts quieted, the anger turned to fear. Would this unfold into civil war? What does this mean for the future of democracy? Not resisting or denying the fear gave rise to a surge of helplessness and despair for our country and the world. As I continued to allow and attend to what was unfolding, I found that embedded in the despair was caring and sorrow. The grief now emerging was not only for the real suffering the attack had caused, but also for the suffering that had generated the attack, and the future suffering it might portend for us all. Radical acceptance of the unfolding emotions had carried me home to sacred space, and it was now possible to respond to this violent event with words and actions that would come from a place of clarity and care, not anger. I think that's a wonderful look at the progression that's possible when you have a practice that really allows you to notice and work with those emotions and what's arising. She recognized her own anger and blame and opened herself to that. Then she saw the fear that was underneath that, and she opened to that. And then she ultimately was able to find the tenderness underneath both of those emotions. When Ruby Sales, a civil rights icon and spiritual leader, encounters people who are violating themselves or others, instead of judging or condemning, she inwardly and sometimes outwardly asks, where does it hurt? This allows her to see behind the human behaviors to the pain and suffering driving them, and awakens the presence and compassion at the heart of radical acceptance. And Tara Brach talks about how we need to turn this openness toward ourselves and our own patterns of shame and feelings of unworthiness. She says that we often make parts of ourselves the enemy. Many of us move through our days condemning ourselves for our insecurity, our addictions, our bodies, our uncontrolled emotions, our self-centeredness. The underlying pain of feeling unlovable and flawed has fueled the highest rates of depression and anxiety ever recorded, resulting in a global epidemic of loneliness and an alarming increase of suicide, especially in young adults. Radical acceptance, however, doesn't mean that we allow others to harm us. And she quotes a Buddhist teacher, Joan Halifax, who talks about the concept of having a strong back and a soft front. Clarity, boundaries, courage, empowerment, and the willingness to protect ourselves and others from injury. We need the capacity to be fierce, to speak truth, and fight injustice. And we need a soft front, acceptance, tenderness, and caring that includes all beings, even when their behavior is hurtful. By developing this mix of strength and openness, our lives become an active expression of love. Radical acceptance brings us freedom. It is a relinquishing of fear and our constant need to control. It is the opposite of self-grasping, the cause of all of our suffering. It is letting go of our grasping. Whereas grasping after our own self implies that we are making the fundamental error of believing in the existence of a separate self, radical acceptance allows us to let go of that belief. It opens us to the interconnection we have with all others. So, do you ever find yourself in situations you can't control? Of course, we all do. Nothing we try works. No matter how we try to manage the situation, nothing changes. Sometimes we're wanting to change or influence the behavior of someone else, and we're unable to do so, and that leaves us feeling out of control. Sometimes we're struggling in the face of circumstances that are just too big and too powerful to change. Hurricanes, elections, work drama, financial pressure, stress, grief. Things can just press in on us, and we frantically try to change our situations. Tara Brock asks, what would it be like if right in the middle of this busyness, we were consciously take our hands off the controls? What if we were to intentionally stop our mental computations and our rushing around, and for a minute or two, simply pause and notice our inner experience? Learning to pause is the first step in the practice of radical acceptance. She calls it the sacred pause. A pause is a suspension of activity, a time of temporary disengagement when we are no longer moving toward any goal. That pause helps us become available to the present moment, to the eternal now. Now, we talked about shamatha and how it can lead us to help us in that present moment. So our shamatha meditation, our calm abiding meditation, the whole point of that meditation is to notice. It's to notice when our mind has wandered, when it's started to follow the thoughts. We notice, we drop the thoughts, and we return our attention to our breath. This is something similar. It's having that awareness. It's just having that little bit of separation outside of our thoughts and our emotions and all the stories that we're telling ourselves, and are getting caught up in our fears of the future and our concerns for the past. And it's being able to have that awareness to say, I need to pause. I need to drop some of these stories. I need to drop some of these thoughts and these emotions, and I need to return back to the awareness of my breath. One of the most fundamental driving forces of our resistance to the present moment is fear. We all experience fear. Fear is evolutionarily built into us in order to assure our survival. Life forms as primitive as reptiles experience fear. On a purely psychological level, fear is a chain of physical reactions that occur in a sequence. As a fear arises, the chemistry of the body and the nervous system shifts in ways that enable several distinct responses to threatening situations. Increased blood flow to the extremities so that we can get ready to run away, right? Our muscles tense and prepare to fight. Sometimes we may react by freezing and remaining motionless. We might draw into ourselves in kind of a protective motion to protect our core. And there are all sorts of instincts that different animals have to respond to fear as well. And these are very, very primal. And as long as the danger persists, the one pointed focus on self-preservation is maintained. And of course, in an emergency situation like that, that fear is very helpful. And, you know, while the bear is attacking, it's good to have that extra blood flow to the extremities, and it's good to flee. But the real cause of our fear most of the time is not very evident. It often gets us more as that niggling anxiety, right? And that anxiety attaches to whatever is going on most immediately in our lives. Tara Brock says, I might be stuck in a long line at the supermarket checkout counter, afraid that I'm not going to get everything else done because I'm wasting precious time. I might have the early symptoms of the flu and worry that if it gets worse, I'll have to cancel clients or miss teaching my weekly meditation class. I might be helping my son with a school project due the next day and fear that if he doesn't complete the assignment in a creative or thoughtful way, his grade will go down, and with it, his options in choosing a college. Regardless of the external circumstances, my mind grows tight. When I pause and ask what is really bothering me, I realize that in each situation, I am anticipating loss. Loss of something that I think is essential to my life and happiness. We all experience fear like this. We all have anxieties. And it's tempting to feel like if we don't carry the tension of this anxiety, that there will be loss. We feel like having this anxiety is helping. Have you ever been around someone that isn't as anxious as you are about something, right? They just don't care enough, right? You feel like that anxiety is part of actually accomplishing what needs to get done. So we can't let go. We live in this constant state of resistance. How central is this fear to our existence and our experience? So central that the official step of becoming a Buddhist is to take refuge. We have a refuge. Letting go each moment is the experience of resting in that refuge. It is understanding that the tumultuous circumstances of our lives are fleeting, ever-changing, and illusory, and that we do not have to live in a state of resistance in order to survive. How can we have such confidence that if we let go of our fear, things will be okay? Because we and all others have an innate nature that is pure and indestructible. As Buddhists, we call this our Buddha nature. when the Buddha woke up, he woke up to the intrinsic nature that was already there and always had been and is always in us and always has been. Buddha nature refers to the intrinsic potential for enlightenment that is present in all sentient beings. This concept expresses the belief that every individual, regardless of their present state, possesses an inherent, pure nature that is fundamentally identical to that of a Buddha. Despite being obscured by ignorance, negative emotions, and habitual tendencies, this innate Buddha nature is ever present and can be realized through proper practice. And that nature exists right now. In this eternal present, we have that nature and we just need to uncover it. Living in openness to the present moment helps us to tap into the compassion and awareness that is part of that present. And part of that nature, part of our pure nature. Holding on to resistance doesn't change that nature, but it clouds our view. It disconnects us from what we fundamentally are. One beautiful thing about radical acceptance and openness is that openness just feels so much better than fear and resistance. And in a sense, anything that is out of alignment with our Buddha nature, our true nature, will cause friction and resistance. But there is a better way. It allows us to live in the eternal present moment, and it allows us to live with an open heart. And that will help us to find our true nature. Thank you for being such a patient and attentive audience. If you have any questions, we have microphones on both sides, and you may make your way up to the microphone, and I'll do my best to answer. And I will say that when I start making a talk, no matter what topic I have in mind, it ends up being something that I needed to hear and work on. So it always comes back to that. So thank you for humoring me on my own therapy here. Yes.
Good morning. Thank you so much for your talk.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate it because it was speaking to some of the questions and struggles that I'm having when it comes to incorporating like an individual practice of Dharma with like bigger, more macro aspirations of essentially social justice. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more, elaborate a little bit more on why is it that openness to beauty and to goodness, why does that help us address something systemic and poisonous such as racism, privilege, inequality?
Mm-hmm. So, my first thought that came to mind when I think about that is the concept of interconnectivity or interdependence, right? Whenever one practices virtue, it has a ripple effect throughout others. Whenever one practices selfishness, it similarly has that ripple effect. And often we can't necessarily trace that ripple effect and where it's going, but it's definitely there. Living in a state of openness to others might have an effect just within your own family unit, or you and your roommates, or whatever your living situation is, right? Those closest to you. I have a trans child. That child has grown up in an accepting environment. In some ways, many of the potential that he has may have been limited if he had grown up in an environment that wasn't open. That's one example, I think. So how does that go into the macro level? Because I'm talking about one person, right? I'm talking about one family unit and things like that. It's difficult to see, but I think there are also generational changes like that that start to happen, where it's not just me and my family and my son, but it's many, many others that start to happen, and that develops some of the change over time. I think also of the Buddhist concept of right action, right? And right livelihood. The more we choose our livelihoods based on what is beneficial, what is helpful, I think that also contributes in many ways to social justice. I think also, and this is where it gets really tough, I quoted someone that says, "Where does it hurt?" A civil rights activist who says, "Where does it hurt when confronted with someone who is racist or very much closed off and carries a lot of prejudice." And I don't think we're going to change a lot of hearts and minds without learning to be loving to people who are hurting. Do I think that means allowing people who are expressing such awful behaviors to have positions of leadership and not contradicting what they're trying to teach to young people on YouTube or something like that? Absolutely not. We want to absolutely, what's the word I'm trying to say? Kind of sideline, push out their teachings and make their behaviors disqualifying for leadership and things like that. But we have to learn to remain open to themselves. And that's hard. And that's why I said during this election season, that's one of the hardest things to deal with, is not closing yourself off to the people whom you disagree with the most. And I do think that most social change in this country happens on a very local level. And by local, I mean families and friends and things like that. I think the changing minds about the LGBTQ community is one great example where it didn't change because laws changed in this state or that. The change happened because people, I think most of it was, oh, I've got a family member who is gay, and I love that family member. And, it just changed perceptions, person after person. And I think it made a huge difference. So I don't know, I'm very much rambling, very much rambling up here, but I do think that radical openness and acceptance leads to social change. I just don't know that it always happens in the way that we're expecting social change to happen with elections and new laws and Supreme Court decisions and things like that. That sometimes happens, but it seems like it's that local level of a change in values that really, really is where things start. Does that answer your question? That's one person's opinion, but that's what I would say. Anyone else? Oh, couple, yeah.
Good morning, and
Good morning.
thank you for your talk today. This is my first time here, and I've been
welcome.
sitting there racking my brain of how to formulate this question, but what is the Buddhist approach to depersonalizing experiences that create trauma or like personal violence that is incurred? How do you depersonalize and detach like anger and grief from perpetrators of violence?
So I will speak more from what I've heard from my teachers. First of all, we absolutely accept the findings of science and psychology and therapists and things like that. We absolutely would encourage someone to remove themselves from a situation of being with an abuser. And I don't think that's contradictory at all to being open and things like that. I also think that might be one of those places where you need to work with it very gradually and carefully and with professional help kind of things, because that trauma is often the source of a lot of our fears, and on a level that's really hard and difficult to work with. And the last thing we would want to do is try to say, oh, just let it go, That's not really the way something that deep works. So I do think it would definitely be a very gradual process, and one that one would work with. I remember we have several different types of practices that involve visualizations and things like that. And I remember Lama Kathy talking about having someone very, very difficult in her life. And the practice was given to her where you basically exchange your own, you take on their suffering and you give them your happiness. And she told her teacher, this is very difficult for me with this particular person. And Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche told her, just imagine yourself showing up every time you do this meditation, every day, visualize her and just show up giving her a gift. Just give her a gift in her, him, I don't know who it was, in your meditation. And she said it helped to soften her own heart over time, to where she was able then to connect to that person's hurt and things. But again, Again, we believe in therapy. We believe in psychological findings, and anything that's going to cause more trauma or bring up trauma in an unhealthy way in meditation practice, I would say work with the meditation teacher and or your therapist or psychologist or something on that. It's not something we would say, yeah, just go in and face it or something like that. We recognize it's very difficult. And actually some of the more, I was talking to Lama Adam the other day, and some of the modern meditation findings and things like that are taking trauma into account in some of the newer teachings now, because it's been found that that's a very necessary thing for many people. So, yeah. Arvin, welcome back. Long time no see. Arvin's been living in Colorado for a while. I'm not sure if you still are or not.
I don't know if I have a question or it's more subtextual commentary.
Mm-hmm.
The backdrop or context to your teaching today. I don't know if this story is true, and I may have it wrong, but it's about Dilgo, is it Dilgo Khyentse?
Mm-hmm.
Having audience with the king and queen of Bhutan in their shrine room, and let's put it this way, he had to open himself up and be an acceptance and used it as his bathroom. But I like what you had to say about, thinking about how it feels, whatever situation you're in. And, I've had the opportunity to work with, be in the presence of some of Dilgo's disciples and students and stuff, and I think you touched on it. I've been in situations where, well, let me back up and say, we talk about the three jewels, we talk about refuge, and I think, at least for me, I take that as things are safe. Mm-hmm. The three jewels are safe, the Sangha's safe. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily safe, in my experience. And, being around some of those folks that I mentioned and seeing on a day-to-day rubber meets the road, and how things unfold, whether it's in their song or in their personal life, and hearing you talk about Dilgo, it's just like, well, who's given the teaching? And do they actually, do they deal with the results of their own behavior? And does this align with their teachings? And I can't do anything else but sit back and shake my head sometimes and think about the fact that taking refuge doesn't necessarily mean safety, or at least not in the way we think it does. And usually it's just an instruction for how we deal with our own disappointment and when things really do hurt, because we're seeing things unfold in front of us and we're like, okay, this doesn't match up with what my expectations were. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a really challenging thought. Yeah,
to say the least.
Yeah, no, I do want to say that when we take refuge in the three jewels, I think we're taking refuge in the essence of those jewels, that which is our Buddha nature, which is beyond the impermanence that will let us down. Not necessarily the individuals who are around us who are subject to that impermanence and who will let us down. Does that make sense? But that said, I will say that, it's not necessarily an easy thing to let go of your self-interest and expect safety, right? Yeah, that's a very good call. But at the same time, like Karmapa reminded us, what is actually our self-interest? The purity of our open hearts can remain protected in doing that. So, very good points. Oh, yes, one more, David, last one.
You're welcome, Marcus. This is really good, really great. It's made my mind more open. You're welcome to just say yes or no. Is openness the same as acceptance and being aware and awake?
It's a really good question. I think openness and acceptance, in many ways, I think I use them interchangeably. The way I was thinking of them. It doesn't mean approval or condoning circumstances or behaviors or something like that. So I think there's definitely a line to draw there. But I think being open to something, I think of that as a feeling. Being accepting means not to reject. So maybe a slight difference there. Awareness, I always think of awareness as that little bird's eye view that sits outside of the tumult of our minds and says, whoa, you're caught up in an emotion. And I've got enough awareness that I can see that I can point to it, that I can call that out. That's where I think of the awareness. I think in its ultimate form, it's part of enlightenment. I think there's also a clarity. I think when people try to put words to enlightenment, I think awareness is part of it, but not necessarily all of it. But it's all in the same path, I think. It's all heading the right direction, semantics aside. So, but yeah, I'm not the scholar that can really answer your question totally. All right, if you want to grab your handouts again, let's recite the dedication of merit in English. Basically just saying that the virtue that we've obtained by taking our time to listen to this, by contemplating what it means to be open, to let go of our self-centeredness, let's just dedicate that to everyone and give that goodness widely so that we all can benefit from it. By this merit, may all attain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. The courageous Manjushri, who knows everything as it is, Samantabhadra, who also knows in the same way, and all the bodhisattvas, that I may follow in their path, I completely dedicate all this virtue. All right, thank you very much. Have a good week.
Keep the weather down.